The rain had been falling since late afternoon, steady and soft at first, like a shy visitor tapping at the windows. By evening, it had deepened into a rhythmic drumming, steady as a heartbeat, filling the little stone cottage with a sound both soothing and isolating. Outside, the world blurred, trees melted into shadowy shapes, their branches sagging under the weight of water. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and the faint trace of lavender from the fire-warmed blankets. Isabel sat curled in her chair, a book resting half open on her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. She wasn't reading anymore. She was listening. Listening to the rain, yes, but also to the way it seemed to carry whispers. She had always loved storms. They gave her an excuse to stay indoors without guilt, to light the hearth and brew tea, to lose herself in worlds made of words. But tonight felt different. There was a heaviness to the weather, as if the clouds were not simply spilling rain but pressing the sky downward. A low fog clung to the hills, and the forest beyond the cottage looked impossibly dark, its outlines shifting like something alive. Isabel caught herself glancing toward the window more often than usual, each time expecting to see. What, exactly? She couldn't say. The feeling was neither fear nor excitement, but a strange mixture of both. Like being on the brink of a story you haven't yet been told. The kettle whistled sharply, startling her into motion. She poured the steaming water over dried chamomile blossoms, watching the pale gold tendrils curl upward, scenting the air with something calming and floral. But even as she breathed it in, she couldn't shake the pull of the outside world. She moved to the window and pressed her fingertips to the cold glass. Beyond the rain-slicked panes, the path leading into the forest glistened faintly under the scattered light of the oil lamp. She imagined footsteps there, splashing softly in the puddles, an image so vivid that her chest tightened, though no one was in sight. When the knock came, it was almost too gentle to hear over the storm. A single tap, then another, then silence. Isabel froze, her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her lungs. In her years living here, visitors were rare, and unannounced visitors at night were unheard of. She set her cup down and approached the door slowly, feeling the old wooden boards shift slightly beneath her weight. Another knock, firmer this time. She hesitated, then drew back the latch and opened the door just a crack. A man stood there, though man seemed too simple a word for what she saw. His shoulders filled the doorway, his cloak dripping rain onto the threshold, and his eyes, deep, amber, and unblinking, held hers with a strange intensity. His features were striking, almost beautiful, but edged with something wild, untamed. Behind him, the forest swayed, and for an instant, Isabel thought she saw something else moving in the shadows beyond, something large and hulking, a shape that vanished the moment she blinked. That night, Evelyn stayed in one of the upstairs rooms, a small but cozy space with low beams and a quilt so heavy it felt like being tucked in by an old friend. The window overlooked the river, its dark waters glinting faintly under the clouded moonlight. She lay there listening to the rain slow to a drizzle, then stop altogether. But even in the stillness, there was a sound, soft, almost melodic, that she couldn't place. It was like the sighing of wind through reeds, or the hushed murmur of voices in another room. Sleep came slowly, tugging at her in gentle waves. She woke before dawn, unsure if it was the pale light slipping into the room or the lingering sense that someone had been speaking to her in her dreams. Wrapping herself in the quilt, she padded to the window. The river was calmer now, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple. The poplar trees along the bank stood dark and quiet, their branches heavy with last night's rain. She thought she saw a shape, a figure, standing near the far side of the bridge. But when she blinked, the space was empty again. Downstairs, the innkeeper was already awake, tending to the fire. He looked up and greeted her with a slight smile, as though they had known each other longer than a single night. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked, pouring water into the kettle. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. "The river," he added, as if that explained everything. He didn't elaborate, and Evelyn didn't press, though the question lodged itself in her thoughts. Over breakfast, fresh bread, warm honey, and berries she was certain weren't in season, the innkeeper told her about the village in brief strokes. How it had been here for centuries, how the river had always been its heart. "Some say it remembers," he said, slicing bread with careful precision. It carries stories the way other rivers carry silt. His tone was so matter-of-fact that it was hard to tell whether he was teasing or not. Evelyn wanted to ask more, but the words wouldn't quite form. She was still holding on to the image of that faint shape at the bridge by mid-morning. The sky had cleared into a pale, delicate blue. Evelyn decided to take a walk along the riverbank, her boots leaving shallow impressions in the damp earth. The air was cool and smelled faintly of moss and wood smoke. As she walked, the quiet deepened until it seemed she could hear the river's own breathing. Every so often, she thought she caught a thread of sound, soft, human, but each time she stopped to listen, it faded into the steady rush of water. It left her wondering whether the innkeeper had been speaking in metaphor or whether the river truly had a voice. Late afternoon, the warmth of the morning sun had faded into a soft gray haze. Evelyn had wandered farther along the river than she intended, following the curve of its banks until the village was hidden behind her. The air was thick with the scent of wet leaves, and her boots were speckled with mud. She stopped at a bend where the current slowed, forming a wide, glassy pool. The water here was so still it reflected the trees and sky with perfect clarity, so perfect, in fact, that it took her a moment to realize something was wrong. Her reflection was not moving as it should in the glassy surface. She saw herself. Same coat, same hair pulled back from her face. But the reflected Evelyn was standing perfectly still while she shifted her weight and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. And then, without warning, the reflection smiled at her, slow and deliberate, though she had not smiled at all. The sight was so strange, so quiet in its impossibility, that for a moment she thought she must be dizzy from walking too far. But when she blinked, the reflection tilted its head as if listening for something, then raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture that felt almost like a warning that a sound broke the moment. The low, steady murmur she'd heard the night before. This time, it was clearer, words, though in a language she didn't recognize, woven into the soft movement of the water. The ripples distorted the image, and when the surface settled again, her reflection was back to normal, mirroring her every move. She stepped back quickly, her pulse uneven, the mud at the bank clinging to her boots as if reluctant to let her go. She retraced her steps to the inn, the path somehow seeming longer than before. When she reached the bridge, she glanced down at the current below. The water here was faster, rougher, carrying bits of leaves and twigs downstream. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw faces in the waves, flickers of eyes and cheekbones in the foam, but each one vanished before she could be sure. She crossed without looking down again. That evening, over dinner, she asked the innkeeper if the river had ever behaved strangely. He didn't laugh, didn't dismiss the question. Instead, he set down his fork and studied her for a long moment. "It shows what it remembers," he said at last. "Sometimes the past, sometimes the future, and sometimes things that haven't happened yet but still will." His voice was calm, but there was a gravity to it that made her shiver. "If it showed you something," he added, "then it's already begun." The following morning was unusually bright for the season, the sky a pale gold that seemed to soften the chill in the air. Evelyn rose early, unable to shake the innkeeper's words from the night before. Sometimes the past, sometimes the future. She'd lain awake, turning them over, the image of her smiling reflection lodged in her mind like a pebble in her shoe. By the time she came downstairs, the innkeeper was already busy slicing apples for what smelled like a pie. He greeted her with his usual calm warmth, but didn't mention the river, and she didn't ask, not yet. Instead, she walked back to the bend she'd visited the day before. The path was still damp from an early frost, and the grass sparkled faintly in the sunlight. The water at the bend was as still as she remembered, the surface flawless. Evelyn hesitated, then crouched at the edge and reached out her hand until her fingertips brushed the cold surface. She expected ripples to fan out in ordinary rings, but instead, the water seemed to pull inward, the movement converging toward a single point. From that point, an image began to form, blurry at first, then sharpening into something unmistakable. It was the inn's main room, exactly as it had been the night before. The fire, the bookshelves, the kettle hissing on the hearth. But there was something else, someone else. In the vision, a man she didn't recognize was standing at the counter, speaking with the innkeeper in a low voice. The man's coat was long and dark, and though his face was turned slightly away, she caught the sharp line of his jaw, the pale of his skin. She strained to hear, but the image rippled and dissolved before she could catch the words. She sat back on her heels, her heart quickening. The man hadn't been in the inn when she'd arrived in the village. Of that she was certain. Was this the past, the future, or something entirely different? She glanced around, half expecting someone to be watching, but the riverbank was empty save for a few birds pecking at the damp earth. The only sound was the steady movement of the current beyond the bend. When she returned to the inn, the innkeeper looked up from the counter, where he was polishing a row of mismatched cups. His gaze lingered on her a moment longer than usual, as though he knew exactly where she'd been. "You went to the bend," he said, not a question. She opened her mouth to respond, but he added quietly, "When the river shows you someone, it's because your path will cross theirs." Evelyn swallowed, unsure if she felt more curious or uneasy. In her mind, she saw again the man's pale face and dark coat, and wondered just how soon their paths would meet. By the time Evelyn left the inn that afternoon, the sky had shifted to a dull pewter, the kind that made the air feel heavy. She decided to wander through the village. Its handful of streets were narrow and lined with stone buildings, most with shuttered windows and ivy creeping up their sides. The occasional villager passed her with a nod or brief glance, but no one stopped to speak. It was the kind of quiet that felt woven into the place, as if everyone knew each other's rhythms too well to disturb them. She was pausing to study the display in the window of a small bookshop when a faint change in the air made her turn. At the far end of the street, a man was walking toward her. Even from a distance, she recognized the dark coat, the sharp line of his jaw, the man from the river's vision. Her breath caught, not from fear exactly, but from the strange, weightless sense that she had stepped into a moment already written. He moved with a measured pace, his gaze fixed ahead, and for a moment she thought he hadn't noticed her. But when he drew closer, he slowed and looked directly at her. His eyes were an unsettling pale gray, like stone under shallow water. "You're staying at the inn," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. His voice was quiet, but carried easily in the still air. Evelyn nodded, unsure what to say. "Good," he added after a pause, as if that confirmed something for him. Then, without another word, he stepped past her and continued down the street. She turned to watch him go, feeling an odd pull, part curiosity, part wariness. The villagers didn't seem to notice him, or if they did, they pretended otherwise. An older woman carrying a basket passed Evelyn and muttered, "Best to let the river decide," before disappearing into a side alley. The words made no sense, yet they carried the same tone as the innkeeper's cryptic remarks. She found herself wishing she'd asked the woman what she meant. When she returned to the inn, the innkeeper was stoking the fire. "You saw him," he said simply, without looking up. Evelyn hesitated before replying. "Yes." "Who is he?" The innkeeper's hands paused on the poker. "Someone who's been here before," he said, his voice even but faintly tinged with something. Regret, perhaps. "And someone the river doesn't forget." His answer was no answer at all, and yet it filled Evelyn with the uneasy certainty that she hadn't seen the last of the man in the dark coat. The rain returned that evening, thin and steady, threading down the inn's windows like strands of glass. Evelyn sat at her usual table near the fire, a book open in front of her, but unread. The innkeeper was somewhere in the back, and the common room was otherwise empty, until the door opened. A gust of damp air swept in, carrying the scent of wet stone, and the man in the dark coat stepped inside. He shook the rain from his shoulders, scanning the room until his gaze settled on her. Without asking, he crossed to her table and took the seat opposite her. "You went to the bend," he said, his voice low, as though they were the only two people in the world. Evelyn's breath caught, but she managed a calm reply. "I did." He studied her for a long moment, his pale gray eyes unreadable. "Then you've seen something." It wasn't a question. She hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "I saw you," she admitted. A faint smile touched his lips, just enough to be noticed. "The river's selective," he said. "It doesn't show people unless there's a reason. And if it shows two people to each other," he let the thought trail off, as though the rest was obvious. Evelyn leaned back slightly, feeling both drawn in and wary. "And what reason would that be?" she asked. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something like recognition or perhaps caution. "It means something is coming," he said finally. "Something that ties us both to this place. The river remembers what was, and it waits for what will be. But it doesn't tell us which is which." Before she could press him further, the innkeeper emerged from the back room, carrying a tray. His eyes flicked to the stranger, and for a moment the room felt taut, as if an invisible thread had been pulled tight. "You'll be wanting a room," the innkeeper said, his voice neutral. The man nodded once, then rose from the table. As he passed Evelyn, he murmured just loud enough for her to hear, "When it begins, you'll know. And you'll wish you hadn't asked." Then he was gone up the stairs, leaving behind the faint scent of rain and something older, harder to name. The rain had washed the air clean by morning, leaving the sky pale and clear. Evelyn didn't expect to see the stranger so soon, but when she came downstairs, he was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cup of black coffee, staring at the window as though waiting for something beyond it. The innkeeper moved quietly around the room, but there was a watchfulness in his movements, as if he were bracing for a change in the weather no one else could feel. Evelyn ate quickly, her mind unsettled from the night before. The stranger's words had clung to her in the dark. "When it begins, you'll know." When she rose to leave, she was surprised to hear his voice. "I'll walk with you," he said simply, already reaching for his coat. She almost refused, but curiosity won over hesitation. They stepped outside together, the air carrying the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. They followed the path toward the bend in the river without discussion. When they arrived, the water was still as glass, reflecting the leafless poplars in delicate lines. The stranger stepped forward first, crouching at the edge. "You've seen me here," he said. "Now see what it wants us to see." Before Evelyn could ask what he meant, he dipped his fingertips into the surface. The water responded instantly, not in ripples, but in a slow, deliberate swirl that widened outward, pulling light into its center until an image began to form. At first, it was only a blur, but then the shape sharpened. Evelyn saw herself and the stranger standing on the stone bridge at dusk. Around them, the river churned violently, the air thick with mist. The innkeeper was there too, holding something in his hands, a bundle wrapped in dark cloth. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel the urgency in his movements. Then, just as quickly, the image shifted. In the next moment, Evelyn was alone on the bridge, the stranger nowhere in sight, and the bundle gone. The vision fractured into shards of light before vanishing entirely, leaving the water calm once more. Evelyn pulled her hand back from the edge, realizing only then that she had mirrored his gesture, her own fingertips grazing the water beside his. The stranger stood, his expression grim. "That's not far off," he said quietly. "Days, maybe less." She opened her mouth to demand an explanation, but he was already walking back toward the inn, his pace quick, as if the vision had confirmed something he'd been waiting for all along. Evelyn remained at the bank for a long moment, staring at her reflection, wondering whether the river had shown her a warning or a promise. By the following afternoon, the village seemed to have shifted in ways Evelyn couldn't quite name. People moved with a subtle urgency, as though there was a list of unspoken tasks they needed to finish before nightfall. She passed two men boarding up the windows of a shed, their conversation halting when she walked by. The baker, usually quick with a smile, pressed a warm loaf into her hands without a word, his eyes flicking toward the river before retreating inside. Even the air seemed heavier, holding a quiet that felt expectant. Back at the inn, the innkeeper was moving with unusual precision, checking locks on doors and counting items on the shelves behind the counter. When Evelyn asked if something was wrong, he gave a faint shake of his head. "Not wrong, just close." He didn't elaborate, but when she pressed, his eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. "You've seen the bridge," he said softly. "That means it's coming sooner than I hoped." The stranger appeared later that day, his presence filling the room without effort. He carried no luggage, only a folded piece of parchment that he slid into the innkeeper's hand. Evelyn caught a glimpse of a single symbol inked in black, a circle with a slash through it, before the innkeeper tucked it out of sight. Whatever it meant, it brought a flicker of something to the older man's face. Not fear exactly, but a wary respect. That evening, The mist rolled in from the river earlier than usual, curling around the inn's windows before the sun had fully set. Evelyn stood at the upstairs window of her room, watching it rise and swirl like something alive. Somewhere beyond it lay the stone bridge, hidden from view. She felt a pull toward it, an almost magnetic urge to walk there now, to see what waited. But the memory of the vision kept her rooted in place. Downstairs, she could hear the low murmur of the innkeeper and the strangers speaking by the fire. The words were too soft to make out, but every so often she caught her own name in the mix. She told herself she'd go down and demand answers, but instead she sat in the quiet, her hand pressed against the cool glass of the window. The mist thickened until it swallowed the entire view, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt certain that the river was not just watching, it was waiting. The mist never lifted the next day. It clung to the streets in heavy layers, so thick that the outlines of buildings blurred into pale shadows. The river's voice was louder now, not just the sound of moving water, but a steady, rhythmic pulse beneath it, like a heartbeat heard through stone. Evelyn felt it in her chest as she moved through the inn, every beat urging her toward the bridge by late afternoon. The light had dimmed to the color of pewter. Evelyn descended the stairs and found the innkeeper at the counter, a dark-wrapped bundle resting in his hands. It was the same size and shape as the one she had seen in the river's vision. He looked up when he saw her, and for the first time, his calm demeanor cracked. "You shouldn't be here when it happens," he said, his voice low. "But I think you already know that you will be." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The stranger entered without knocking, his coat damp from the mist. "It's time," he told the innkeeper. The older man nodded, securing the bundle under one arm before stepping out from behind the counter. Evelyn followed them into the street without being asked. The mist swallowed the world, reducing their footsteps to muffled echoes. They reached the bridge just as the river's sound deepened into something almost like a voice, words rising and falling in a language she didn't understand. The water below was no longer calm, but thrashing, white foam breaking against the stones. The innkeeper stopped in the center of the bridge, turning to face the stranger. "It will remember," he said. The stranger's expression was unreadable as he took the bundle from the innkeeper's hands. Evelyn stood at the edge of the bridge, her fingers curled around the damp railing. The vision from the river played in her mind, every detail aligning, except one. In the vision, she had been standing beside the stranger, not apart from him. Now, as he stepped toward the railing with the bundle, he turned his head toward her and said something she couldn't hear over the roar of the river. Then, without hesitation, he dropped the bundle into the churning water below. The moment it struck the surface, the mist surged upward, wrapping them all in a blinding white. When the mist broke, it didn't fade, it tore. In a sudden rush, the air cleared, and the churning river below stilled as if an unseen hand had pressed it flat. Evelyn blinked, her breath catching. Where moments before the bundle had vanished into violent water, now there was nothing but a perfect, glassy surface. It reflected the three of them standing on the bridge, but the reflection wasn't exact. In the mirrored world below, Evelyn was standing beside the stranger, their shoulders nearly touching, and the innkeeper was gone. The stranger didn't look surprised. "It's not the first time it's taken something," he said quietly, his pale eyes fixed on the water. "But this time, it's giving something back." He stepped closer to the edge, scanning the surface as though reading it. Slowly, shapes began to form in the reflection. A younger version of the innkeeper, smiling beside a woman with Evelyn's same gray-green eyes. Evelyn's throat tightened. She had never seen the woman before, but she knew, with the unshakable certainty the river always seemed to bring, that it was her grandmother. The vision shifted again, showing the innkeeper placing the bundle, still wrapped, into the hands of the woman. She turned, walking into a mist-shrouded distance, the stranger's younger self watching from the shadows. Then the image dissolved, leaving only the reflection of the present-day bridge. Evelyn stepped back, the truth pressing at the edges of her mind. This was why the river had shown her the stranger, why it had pulled her here. They were both bound to the same story, one that had begun long before she was born. The innkeeper moved to her side, his face unreadable but his voice steady. "It remembers her," he said, "and now it remembers you. The river doesn't choose lightly." Evelyn wanted to ask what was inside the bundle, but somehow she knew the answer wouldn't change anything. Whatever it had carried, it belonged to the water now, and to the memory it kept. They left the bridge together, the mist thinning into the crisp air of early night. As they walked back toward the inn, Evelyn glanced over her shoulder at the dark curve of the river. Its surface was calm again, but she could feel its attention like a weight, not threatening, but patient. She realized then that she would never be able to leave this place entirely. Some part of her would always remain here, woven into the current, carried in the river's endless remembering.